it's your lucky day, because as I'm sure you all are thinking, it's incredibly exciting to wake up and at 8:30 hear a lecture on deficit financing. What can be more exciting and titillating than such a lecture? And also, I should say, probably as a defensive measure, but by the time you get to be my age, if you look at me really closely, you can tell I'm a few months older than you. But by the time you get to be my age, I've pretty much given every lecture that I give several times. This is a new lecture, and so you are, as we say, guinea pigs. And so I hope that the torture won't prove to be too bad. Anyway, so the first part of this lecture, and indeed the core of what I want to talk about, is pretty straightforward. It is, as we say, positive analysis and not normative analysis. It's just a basic explanation or investigation as to the cost of government financing. In particular, who pays the cost of government projects when the government funds those projects by borrowing money. And by pay, I'll mention this again, by pay, I mean which parties in society experience a net lifetime reduction in their spending power compared to what it would be had the government not borrowed money to fund the projects. At first, for most of my talk, make no presumptions about the benefits of the projects, whether or not those people who we will see do pay don't mind paying or are terribly upset that they're paying. This is just mostly a question of who actually pays. This was much disputed in the economics profession beginning in the late 1930s. So let me start with an example. Most of these things these pictures I just pulled off the web. So let's say that the Israeli government decides it wants to build a new airport. It's tired of the existing airport. It wants to build one 3 times larger and 10 times more luxurious than Ben Gurion. So how's it going to pay? So it wants to build I Googled gleaming airport to put a picture of a gleaming airport. Purely coincidental. This is a gleaming new airport. It's an artist's rendition of one. And I only realized after I put it in, this is the way the new airport in my place of birth, New Orleans, Louisiana, is going to look like. No airport in New Orleans would be ever as big as one here, but that's a pretty gleaming airport. And so suppose the Israeli government wants to build this big gleaming airport to impress the world, and it's going to cost 25 billion shekels to build that airport. How can it get the funds to pay for it? It's got 3 choices. It's got a mix of these, but let's keep things simple. Let's say it's going to use one of the 3. It can raise taxes today by 25 billion. So raise taxes all in the year 2023 on all Israelis. All Israelis will pay 25 billion more in taxes, or take 25 billion less in other government services. Israeli citizens today can pay more to build this airport. That's one way. It can print. It can create 25 billion worth of new shekels. I'm going to exclude this possibility, at least for now. It would clearly be inflationary, just printing money and then using the newly printed money to acquire the resources to build the airport. Or it can borrow 25 billion. I'm going to assume that's the way the financing will be done. So it's going to, all the funds it needs to get the resources to build the gleaming new airport, it's going to get by borrowing. And here's exactly how they're going to do it. They're going to borrow 25 billion, agreeing to pay 5% annually. The bonds will be due in 30 years, paying 5% annually. That means roughly in 2053, the holders of those bonds are going to present them to the Israeli government, and the Israeli government will be on the hook to pay over roughly $108 billion to the holders of those bonds 25 years from now. So the question is, who pays for the airport to be built? That's Adam Smith. And pardon the Christian, I do this. I very much admire Adam Smith. He's a Scottish moral philosopher. I once had a Scottish terrier named Adam Smith. And if the Scottish terrier had not been alive when my son was born, my son probably would be named Adam Smith. but my son's mother didn't relish the idea of having a dog and a child with the same name, so my son's not named Adam Smith. From the time of Adam Smith through the time of John Maynard Keynes down here, Emily mentioned a little bit about Keynes, I'll say a little bit more in a moment. From the time of Adam Smith until John Maynard Keynes wrote his magnum opus in 1936, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, there was widespread agreement among all economists, except for the few who were widely regarded as monetary cranks. There's widespread agreement that regardless of the merits of whatever projects are being funded with government deficit financing, the people who pay for those projects are the future citizens or taxpayers who are around at the time when the bonds are submitted to the government for redemption. It was widespread. It was just taken as a matter of, it was so obvious. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's great 1776 book, he mentions this. John Stuart Mill, all other classical economists accepted this as a matter of course. John Maynard Keynes then comes along with the Keynesian revolution, as it's called, and changes the narrative completely. Keynes says in one of two scenarios, if the economy is in recession, if there are idle workers and idle resources just laying around doing nothing because they want to be employed but they can't find employment, then any projects funded with deficit financing, no one pays for it. They're absolutely free. It's a free lunch. There is such thing as a free lunch, as we say. These idle resources are drawn out of their idleness, their unwanted idleness, by the deficit financing. The gleaming new airport gets built. It's free. And so, because no one pays, not today's citizens, taxpayers, because no one pays, certainly not paid for by tomorrow's citizens, taxpayers, it's free. I'm going to ignore that particular question of Keynesian economics, whether or not anything really is free in this way. If you want in the Q&A, maybe we can talk about that, but that's not the object of my talk today. Most times, the economy is humming along reasonably close to full employment. We don't have that many idle resources laying around. So even the Keynesians would admit that when the airport is funded with bonds, with deficit financing, it's not costless. Someone's going to pay for it. But the Keynesians said the classical economists were mistaken. The people who will pay for the airport, they exist today. There is no pushing on to future generations, future citizens, taxpayers, of the cost of whatever we do today. That cost is incurred today. And so we don't have to worry about, because the classical economists would say this, we don't have to worry about, we don't have to have any moral qualms about passing along to our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren the costs of whatever we ask government to do today. No, they're off the hook. They don't pay. We're always going to pay today. So we're always responsible. So let's not worry about future citizens, taxpayers. This Keynesian idea was called the New Orthodoxy. It was new because Keynes only wrote his book in 1936, and by 1937 it was still new, but it was accepted. So it was the orthodoxy. So it was called the New Orthodoxy. And so the Keynesians are correct. Here's how they reason. So, well, if the economy is at full employment, all these cranes, which is just another randomly chosen picture off of the internet of an airport being built. I have no idea where this one is. All those cranes, all that concrete, all the new metal, all the workers, all the electricity, all the time that is spent to build the airport today are indeed used today. These things could have been used to do other things today, but instead they're being used to build the airport today. This is key to why the Keynesians said, no, see, the airport's being paid for today, not by future taxpayers. And then when the bonds come due, 30 years from now, here's why, say the Keynesians, there is no net cost to future citizens, taxpayers. Let's assume that all the bonds are held internally. They're all held by Israelis. None are being held by Pakistanis or Americans or South Africans. They're all held by Israelis. So the Keynesians say, so 30 years from now, it's true. Some citizens are going to have their taxes raised in order to pay off these bonds, but the bondholders themselves are Israelis, and so some Israelis are going to give $108 billion to other Israelis. A net wash. Israel, as a society, future Israelis are no better off or worse off as a result of the deficit financing. It's as if a husband gives a wife some money, the net worth of the household doesn't change. The husband may be worse off, the wife is better off, the wife's improvement is offset by the husband's loss, but on the whole, the household itself is the same. The country is the same. This is the Keynesian reasoning. I was fortunate in my career to have two Nobel Prize winning colleagues. The causality ran not from me being there and them winning the Nobel Prize. I just happened to be lucky to be on the faculty. The first one is this guy on the left, James Buchanan. He won the Nobel Prize in 1986, and this, of course, is a picture of him getting the prize from King of Sweden. And he won it for a lot of different work. Some of his work was mentioned in one of yesterday's lectures. He's a founder, along with his longtime colleague and my former colleague Gordon Tullock, of Public Choice Economics. But his first book and his earliest work was on public finance. And his idea for public choice actually came out of his hard thinking about public finance. And in particular, who pays for deficit financing. His first book was published in 1958. It's called Public Principles of Public Debt. So Buchanan was an incredibly prolific scholar. His collected works, which do not contain all of his works, run on to, I don't know, several million volumes. They fill up several libraries worth of stuff. He wrote a paper basically after every breath that he drew. He was incredibly prolific, but he always ascribed his success and his output not to any special genius that he had, although I think he was being modest. He ascribed it to hard work. He said in his lifetime, and he lived a long time, he lived to be 93 years old. He died in 2013, just over 10 years ago. He said he had only one road to Damascus moment, only one moment where he just suddenly had a brilliant insight. He tells the story in rather excessive detail. He was having breakfast one morning at a hotel in Rome. He even gives the name of the hotel, which I can't remember. He's having breakfast. He's thinking about deficit financing. That's what nerds do. And he said he was walking down the stairs from the restaurant after having breakfast. He has this emblazoned in his memory. He's walking down the stairs, and he suddenly realizes why the new orthodoxy, which he had accepted for all of his career, why the new orthodoxy was wrong. This is late 1957. He says he runs back to his hotel room. He skipped the meeting. He jots down notes as to why it's wrong. And within a few months, he writes his first book, which was published, and a great success. Again, Public Principles of Public Debt, explaining why Adam Smith and the classical economists were right and the Keynesians were mistaken. So let's investigate now in some more detail, who pays? Well, it's obviously not, again, who pays in the sense of which parties in society experience a net decrease in their purchasing power over their lifetime as a result of the government funding projects paid for with borrowed money. Well, it's obviously not today's citizens, taxpayers. I'm just going to from here on in say today's citizens or today's taxpayers rather than both words. It's awkward. It's not today's citizens. The reason they borrowed the money is to avoid having to pay today. The Israeli government could have raised taxes by $25 billion, or it could have reduced the government benefits on other scores by $25 billion, could have reduced defense spending, could have reduced social welfare spending by $25 billion in order to get the resources to build the airport. But it didn't do that, and it didn't raise taxes. So today's citizens, they are no worse off or because of this. Their spending power hasn't declined. That's why, presumably, the Israeli government chose to borrow the funds rather than to increase the taxes today. The temptation might be to say that the creditors, the people who loaned the money to government, paid for the airport. But that's clearly incorrect. When you lend money to someone, you don't think of yourself as paying for whatever that someone is producing or buying with those funds. Your net worth isn't declining. In fact, your net worth is increasing. Presumably, the creditors loaned the money to the Israeli government on the belief that the sacrifice of spending power today, $25 billion worth of spending power today, in exchange for $108 billion worth of spending power 30 years from now, that increased their net wealth. Presumably, it does. If we have time at the end, we can talk about the possibility of default. Yeah, Bob?
Don, I just want to ask as a qualifier that every bond needs to be secured by something. People don't lend you money unless they know what guarantees the debt. And is it not true that the underlying assumption of the government debt is the ability of the government to tax?
Yes, yes.
So one way or another, behind this debt is the ability of the government to raise taxes among the citizens.
That's a good point. I mean, this anticipates my conclusion, of course, and Buchanan's conclusion. Yeah, the reason people lend money seemingly unsecured to the government, at least reasonably stable governments, the Israeli government, the U.S. government, the French government, is the understanding, the confidence that when the bonds come due, the government will have the power to extract the requisite amount of resources from the citizens who will pay those bonds in order to pay those bonds off. So that's the security. But formally, there is no security. There's no formal collateral that the Israeli government will put up in this case to secure those bonds. The government just says, I'm the Israeli government, here's a bond drawn on me, us, 20, 30 years from now. You want to buy it? Creditors say yes, they turn over the money. But the creditors here, they obviously engage in this transaction because they believe that their net wealth is increasing. So they do give up spending power today. They otherwise would have spent that $25 billion today. Their spending power falls today, but over their lifetime, over the lifetime of the bondholders, their spending power is going to increase. They or their family will increase. They expect that the $108 billion 30 years from now is worth more in terms of real spending power to them than the $25 billion spent today. So the creditors don't pay. The creditors don't think of themselves as buying the airport. They're just lending the money to whoever it is who are buying the airport. What about the workers? I'll give you another example of this later to drive Buchanan's point home. They're identical to the workers or other suppliers of the materials, the suppliers of the steel, the concrete, the machines used today to build the airport. They're in the same position as the creditors. They're turning over their resources to this project, not because they're buying the airport, they're getting a piece of the airport. They're turning over their time as workers and their materials as input suppliers because they're getting paid to do so, and they believe that the payment that they're getting in return for spending their time and resources in those ways is worth what they're getting paid. So they're going to get paid in shekels, and they're going to spend those shekels. So the workers and the other suppliers, they're not paying for the airport. They're being paid to help to construct the airport today. What about people or consumers generally, citizens, taxpayers generally? It might be said that, well, the resources that are being used to build the airport, those are resources that, were they not used to build the airport, would be used to produce other things, could be used to produce goods for consumption today. But instead, the government borrowed the money, started to build an airport, and so the Israeli economy and the people in the Israeli economy are made poorer by $25 billion. that too is mistaken, and I want to spend some time explaining why that's mistaken. Although, at the end of my talk, I'll point to a kernel of truth in that, but not one that the Keynesians believed to be true. So, if we want to, if the stance is, so again, we know that today's citizens, taxpayers don't pay, the creditors don't pay, the workers and the other suppliers don't pay. So you might think, well, the use of the, I'm just summarizing now, the use of the resources which are used today to pay for the airport. That means that as the Keynesians say, the cost of building the airport is incurred today. There's no cost to be pushed off, as the classical economists said, onto future generations. Why do I believe, why does Buchanan believe that's wrong? Well, let's ask, put yourself in the position of the creditors who loan the $25 billion. You can think of this as many, many people who loan the $25 billion. If it's easier, you can think of it as one very rich person who lent the Israeli government 25 billion shekels. It doesn't matter. So put yourself in the position of those creditors or that creditor and ask, which is the ultimate question, by the way, in all of economics, as compared to what? What's the alternative? What would have happened instead? If the creditors hadn't lent those 25 billion worth of shekels, 25 billion worth of real resources today, to the government, they could have done one of two things with those funds. They could have, because it's their money, they could have spent it all on themselves. $25 billion worth of extra consumption today. Elaborate vacations to Tahiti. Build spectacular villas filled with, gold-plated jacuzzis. They could. It's their money. They could have spent it that way. If they had spent it that way, no one would say, oh, well, the citizens of Israel paid for those vacations to Tahiti and those gold-plated jacuzzis in the spectacular villas. The people who paid in that case for these consumption goods would have been these people who would have been creditors who instead spent the 25 billion all in their current consumption. So the point here is that current citizens, taxpayers, aren't out anything that belongs to them because these would-be bondholders instead spent the money on consumption. It follows, therefore, that today's citizens, taxpayers are not out anything. They're not paying for anything. They're not suffering any loss of something that belongs to them by virtue of anything that the creditors do with their funds. So the creditors, in fact, don't spend it on consumption. Another thing they could have done, the other thing they could have done, the creditors, had they not lent the money to the government to build the airport, they could have, and this is by far the more likely alternative, they could have instead lent the money to some other project. And to keep the explanation straightforward, let's assume that other project is a private project. So let's say that the creditors instead instead of lending it to, let's say their next best alternative was not to spend it on themselves. Their next best alternative to lending it to the government to build the airport was to lend the money to Boeing, which does borrow money, to build airliners for sale to El Al. This is not an unusual kind of transaction. I have no idea if the sum of money is accurate, but that doesn't matter. So if instead the creditors would have lent their 25 billion shekels to Boeing to build these jetliners for sale to El Al, then we would ask, so who pays for that? We'll see that Boeing ultimately pays for that. And to see that, we have to ask, well, what would have been the creditor's next best option had they not lent the money to Boeing. Let's say their next best option would have been to lend it to Apple Inc. in Cupertino, California, to expand their factories. They don't do that. The creditors don't do that. They instead lend their money to Boeing. Boeing uses those funds to build a number of jetliners. Those jetliners get built. They sell the jetliners to El Al. El Al pays Boeing presumably something more than $25 billion for the fleet of jetliners. Boeing then takes part of some of those funds that El Al pays to it and then repays the creditors. That's what would have happened if the creditors had instead not loaned the money to the government, but instead had loaned the money to Boeing. No one would say in either case, the consumption case or the creditors lending the money to Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer, no one would say, oh, those planes or that consumption was paid for by today's citizens' taxpayers. Today's citizens' taxpayers in Israel, they're not out anything. Their net worth isn't reduced at all by this transaction. Bob?
You want me to wait till the end, or should I ask now?
You can ask now.
Okay, so I actually think that's not true. Because if we take the assumption and say, okay, if you borrow the money, it doesn't have any impact on today's taxpayers. But if I ask the question, can you do this infinitely? Let's say today they borrowed $25 billion. Tomorrow they borrow another $25 billion, and clearly there's an implication that in each iteration, the assumption that the taxpayers are behind this becomes more weak. You know? So in fact, there are implications that when they borrow the money, they are tapping the wealth, the capacity to pay by current taxpayers. So there is indeed an implication.
They're tapping the. We don't disagree. By borrowing today, the government is tapping the ability of future taxpayers to pay, and there's obviously a limit to that. If creditors believe that future taxpayers will revolt, in effect, not pay the full amount, then they become much more reluctant to lend. The interest rate charged by the government, the interest rate they'll charge the government will rise so high the government can't borrow, or it will risk default.
To say it another way, the question: if right now the national debt is zero, and they borrowed $25 billion, okay, so I'd say there's implications. If today the national debt is $1 trillion, not zero, and then they want to borrow, it's different. And the difference is that the current fiscal reality, the current wealth reality of the country is different because it's still keeping in debt. So I think there are implications that current reality is relevant.
So maybe I should have said wait to the end, because I'm going to talk about current reality. So the particular question now is, who is responsible for paying the debt incurred today by the government? And so I'm just assuming that the Israeli government is able to borrow 25 billion shekels at an annual interest rate of 5% payable in 30 years. And so the question, who will pay that debt? I just want to identify those parties. And the party that I'm identifying, I've already given the game away, the party that I'm identifying, Buchanan identified, and I think Buchanan was correct. The party paying that debt are the future taxpayers. And at this point, it doesn't matter whether the future taxpayers don't mind paying the debt. They just love having a new airport, and they're more than happy to have to fork over the funds to pay for it. Doesn't matter whether they feel fleeced or whether they feel blessed. As an accounting matter, they are the ones who pay. Right now, I'm just explaining, which I agree with, Jim Buchanan's explanation that when government engages in deficit financing, the cost of that financing is pushed off to taxpayers in the future. Taxpayers in the future are going to experience a net reduction in their purchasing power as a result of the debt undertaken today. At the end, when I get to my conclusion, I'm going to, I do think there are negative implications of deficit financing on today's citizens' taxpayers because of the deficit financing. But it's not because, so the Keynesian argument is that, no, there's no implication for future citizens of today's deficit financing because all the costs of today's deficit financing are incurred today. There's nothing pushed forward to the future. I'm saying, along with Buchanan, that there is something pushed off to the future. And I think precisely because of that, and everything I say basically is from Jim Buchanan here, precisely because of that, we will see some negative implications of deficit financing on today's fiscal situation. But it is being pushed, the responsibility for paying is being pushed forward. That's all I'm saying right now. You look skeptical. Okay. You're a Keynesian. So back to my train of thought here. Because the money, starting with the assumption that the money lent by the creditors to the government or to whoever they lend it to belongs to them, they can do with it whatever legal exchanges they wish to do with it. And so lending it to the government, lending it to Boeing, spending it on lavish jacuzzis, that's their business. Under none of those options do we say that other people are somehow imposed upon because of those transactions. So the fact that the resources used today to build the airport are lent to the government by today's creditors is not an imposition, at least not, I'm going to show a sort of a roundabout way in which today's citizens are harmed. But it's not an accounting imposition on today's citizens. They don't pay. They escape, indeed, the obligation to pay precisely because they chose to borrow. They could have chosen to have their taxes raised or to take $25 billion less in government benefits. But instead, they chose to borrow the money. They chose to escape. Today's citizens, taxpayers did. Chose to escape the obligation to pay for the airport by engaging in deficit financing. So let me, my experience is when I teach this to students, this is, and you can tell, I mean, there's a huge debate, well, it was a debate in the mid-20th century about this. It's not the most intuitive concept, unlike most economics, which are incredibly intuitive, I believe. So let me give another example.
Just a question.
Yeah.
On the other hand, just the size of the debt, a very new and improved airport might be beneficial to the growth, but it's something that is unmeasurable at the point of taking on the debt.
I'm going to talk about
so
that.
The debt owners of the future will also might enjoy prosperity and growth.
I'm going to talk about that. Yeah. At this point, this is not an argument against deficit financing. This is simply an argument about who pays.
No, the question is if the project
might
be a prosperous project that
I
will
understand.
encourage growth, or it's a welfare project that will only cost.
I
don't know.
I understand, but even if something turns out unambiguously to be productive, it's still not free. Someone's paying for it, and so the question is, who is paying for it, right? And I bought a house for myself, and for me, it's productive. I'm happy I bought it, but it's not free. I still pay for it. Yeah.
Can you explain again the Keynesian argument for why taxpayers today pay? Because I understand that the loans would be returned to Israelis by Israelis in 30 years, but what's the mechanisms and who actually is paying the debt today, according to Keynes?
So the Keynesian argument is that if, and let's assume there's full employment, so there's nothing is free. The government borrows money today, and it does. You spend those borrowed funds to actually direct resources, real resources, human labor, steel, machines, to build the airport. And so the bonds are due in 30 years' time. So the Keynesians say, well, the cost of the airport is incurred today because the resources used to build the airport are actually used today to build the airport. There's no pushing forward the cost, and here's why. This is your question, I think. Tell me if it's not. Tell me if it's not, and I'll try again. The cost of building the deficit financing is not pushed on to future taxpayers as a group, because assuming, as I am doing, that all the bonds are held by Israelis 30 years from now, let's say this is, you guys own the bonds, you're the taxpayers who are going to pay, you submit your bonds to this side of the room, they have to pay 108 billion shekels to you, they're out 108 billion shekels. You as a group now have an additional 108 billion shekels. This is Israel. Israel as a whole is no worse off or better off when those transactions take place. Does that answer your question?
It's just redistribution of money, so part of the taxpayers lose purchasing power and some gain it?
Yep, that's the Keynesian argument. The Keynesians thought of, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, but the Keynesians, and I think this is one of the many weaknesses of Keynesian economics, they thought in terms of huge aggregates of people. And I believe when you do that, you miss the important realities of economics, because you're missing what's going on at the individual level. So they're thinking at the country level, and they say, well, as a country, the only thing that matters is, has the net worth of the country fallen 30 years from now? Well, it hasn't, say the Keynesians. Again, you guys are out 108 billion. You guys have 108 billion. If this is all Israel, again, it's like the husband transferring some funds to the wife, or the wife transferring some funds to the husband in the household. The household isn't any better off or worse off. One individual's worse off, but another individual's improvement offsets the decline in the welfare of the first person.
But he does say that some future taxpayers will pay for it.
Yes.
Purchasing power will
Yes. Yeah, they're not denying that someone's got to pay off the bond, but if the debt is internally held, then as a group, citizens, taxpayers in the future, no better off or worse off. Someone else have a question?
Yeah. What about the option that those who will pay for that, no one will pay for that because you will make a new bond in 30 years from now, so you loan like 30 billion shekels, and then 30 years from now, when the due days come, you can make a new bond to pay for that. So it's like, rolling the bonds, not actually paying for it. So you take new bonds and you match it with the growing percentage, and nobody will pay.
Someone has to pay. Someone has to pay for whatever's being, nothing's free. I'm going to assume full employment. I think even with unemployment, that nothing is free. But someone has to pay. We have to identify someone who pays. And it is true, and it happens quite often, particularly stable governments, they roll over the debt, which is what you're explaining. And so it's just pushing it down. Let's say they roll it over for another 30 years. So taxpayers 60 years from now pay for it.
You still have the financing cost.
So the Keynesians say, yeah, but those are minor. We'll ignore it. Those are tertiary costs, as they say. We can ignore that. You got the transaction cost of actually exchanging the bonds. Those are real, but those are minor. say the Keynesians. I want to talk about the actual who pays for the $25 billion worth of resources used today to build the airport. So yes, the bonds can be rolled over, and but they can only be rolled over. And this gets to Bob's point. This is why I'm not sure why Bob thinks he disagrees with me. They can be rolled over only insofar as the creditors today believe or are confident that taxpayers in the future can be tapped for those funds. Now, I know it's a matter of particular circumstances of the government, the time. The Greek government 10 years ago couldn't roll over debt. It was, because no one trusted it. The U.S. government has no trouble rolling over debt because people now still trust the U.S. government.
Maybe it also depends on the country's growth.
Yes, well, but it does, but never. So it could be, in fact, we can assume it's true. It could be that that this airport, this is what this gentleman was saying a moment ago, this airport is so valuable to the economy that it actually contributes to the growth of the economy. That could be true. It still has to be paid for. So I'm not saying it's not worthwhile to engage in this deficit financing. I'm just saying, again, I'm trying to identify who pays. Which party can we identify as having their net lifetime spending power reduced as a consequence of the government borrowing 25 billion shekels today to build an airport today? Whether or not the airport's worthwhile, it could be a boondoggle. It can be the greatest thing the Israeli government ever did in terms of promoting economic growth. Doesn't matter. Someone's got to pay for it. And so let me give this example, which I think makes the point of future taxpayers paying, as being the parties who actually pay for a project. I think it drives it home because it shortens the time period a lot. So here's a very simple example. Let's say that the city of Jerusalem wants to build a new ditch, a new drainage ditch. These are people building a drainage ditch. They're going to hire workers to do it. And here's how they're going to do it. It's going to take 1 week. Very simple example. The government's going to hire 10 workers. They're all identical to each other. They're going to work 10 hours a day. I have no idea if this wage rate is accurate or not. They're going to get paid 50 shekels per hour. And they're going to work for 5 days. Monday, they're going to start on Monday morning, and they're going to end on Friday before sundown, obviously. So that's a total of 25,000 shekels that's going to cost to build that ditch. And we can assume this ditch is utterly needed and utterly necessary and utterly beneficial for the citizens of Jerusalem. So the question, who pays for this? And the deal is, which is not unusual, I assume here, is how it is in the US, the deal is the workers are going to get paid at the end of the week. Hey, workers, I'm going to hire 10 of you. Here's the deal. You work 10 hours a day, 5 days. I'm going to pay you 50 shekels an hour. And then on Friday afternoon, just as you quit work, as you leave work, I'm going to give each of you 2,500 shekels for the work that you've done building this ditch this week. And 10 workers go, great, let's do that. So the workers commence work on Monday morning. You can think of them, because this is in fact what's going on, as lending resources to the government. They're lending their labor to the government. They haven't gotten paid for it yet. They're lending it to the government. They work all day Monday. They haven't gotten paid yet. They are, in effect, creditors to the government. They didn't lend money. They lent their labor, and that's what ultimately matters, the real transfer of resources. So these workers on Monday lend a total of 100 hours of their work, 10 workers working 10 hours a day, to the government. The government borrowed 100 hours worth of labor on Monday, borrowed another 100 hours of labor on Tuesday, borrowed another 100 hours on Wednesday, another 100 hours on Thursday, and a final 100 hours on Friday. Only on Friday do the workers get paid. And what's going to happen is on Friday, the government is going to go to the taxpayers and say, all right, we have the drainage ditch built. I need $25,000 of extra, 25,000 shekels of extra taxes. Taxpayers are going to give the government 25,000 shekels, and the workers will get paid. It's a very simple example. And so if we ask, if we ask on Monday, just as the drainage ditch is about to be, as work on the drainage ditch is about to be commenced, who pays for the drainage ditch? No one would say, oh, the workers pay for the drainage ditch. Taxpayers in the future escape the cost of paying for the drainage ditch. We all realize in this simple example that the people who will ultimately pay for the drainage ditch are the taxpayers whose taxes on Friday will be raised. They're not raised on Monday. They're raised on Friday. So what? So this is a very simple example where the time of the credit extension is only 1 week. And the credit extension here is done by workers agreeing to get paid at the end of the project. But whether it's 1 week, whether it's 30 years, the point is the people who wind up paying for the project are the citizens whose taxes are raised, or again, who agree to take 25, in this case, 25,000 shekels fewer in government benefits. They are the ones who pay for the drainage ditch. Once again, the drainage ditch can be the greatest thing the government ever did. It can yield benefits, you name the shekel value number, in the billions. So it's worthwhile, but it still has to be paid for. It's not free. And it's not paid for by the work. No one would say the workers paid for it. And no one would say that the cost of the drainage ditch, the payment for the drainage ditch, was incurred on Monday when the government contracted with each of these 10 workers, on Monday morning, when the government contracted with each of these 10 workers to build the drainage ditch. No one would say, well, all right, on Monday, and when the workers agreed, okay, we're going to work for a week and not get paid until the end of the week, so the cost of the drainage ditch is born today, is born on Monday when the credit contract is established. It is, the workers don't pay, the citizens, taxpayers, on Friday wind up paying. Now the difference between this, so they're going to go to the tax authority. And I just pulled this off the web. I assume that the tax authority, that Hebrew is what's said in English. I hope it's not a joke. I lost my train of thought with that. So that's a transaction that takes place. So the problem with this little 1 week long period of analysis compared to the 30-year period of analysis is that in 1 week, in a single week, the citizen taxpayers on Friday are pretty much the same citizens taxpayers on Monday. So if the citizens, presumably the government on Monday, they're elected representatives, and they took the appropriate cognizance of what their constituents wanted. Their constituents want a drainage ditch built, and the constituents believe it's worth 25,000 shekels to have the drainage ditch built. So through their representative, the citizens said, "Okay, build the drainage ditch," and we agree to pay 25,000 shekels for it. So it's the same people, and so we can presume that in this case, very easily, that the drainage ditch is worth 25,000 shekels to the people for whom it is built. It's built for the citizens of Jerusalem. They agreed to pay the taxes to fund it. In this way, it's no different than if you go out and buy an automobile on credit. You borrow money from a bank, and you take the money to the auto dealership. You buy the automobile. You're the person who gets the benefit from driving the automobile, and you're the person who will have to repay that debt. The taxpayers on Friday are the same people who agreed on Monday to buy the drainage ditch. So we don't have to worry so much in this example about whether or not the drainage ditch project is worthwhile. We can presume that it's worthwhile, because the same people who agreed to buy it, the citizens today, on Monday, are the same people who are going to pay for it. Presumably they're not going to agree to pay for something that they don't value by the amount that, by at least the amount they have to pay for it. A very different situation, though, arises when the time period extends to 30 years over the life of bonds, particularly if the debt can be rolled over, which it often is. The debt in cases of extensive government financing, that debt is, for the longer it is, that debt is paid for not by the projects that, to be precise, the projects funded with that debt are paid for not by the citizen taxpayers who agree to have the projects undertaken, unlike the drainage ditch. They're paid instead, the airport in my example, are paid for by other people, in many cases people not yet born when the project is undertaken. And now we get to the real problem with deficit financing. I think it is, whether I've convinced you or not, I think it is indisputable that the parties who pay for government debt are the citizen taxpayers whose taxes will be raised to pay off that debt, or whose taxes have to be raised along the way to service the debt when interest payments come due. It depends how the debt is structured. I think that's indisputable. I think the Keynesians were clearly mistaken on that. Now the question becomes, and here we get to some policy implications of deficit financing. What consequence does the ability to engage in deficit financing have on fiscal policy? If it were the case that the government were, for whatever reason, because of a constitutional constraint, the creditors don't like the government, if it were the case that the government is unable to borrow 1 shekel, then anything the government does today has to be paid for either out of current taxes or inflation, which is just another form of current taxation. We can talk about inflation if you like. I'm putting aside now the option of printing money. The government can't borrow, then any project that it wants to undertake, it has to pay for with current taxes. And so we can presume that if that government then undertakes a project today, then the citizen taxpayers who agree to have their taxes raised today believe that it's worthwhile. So they have their taxes raised, the project is undertaken. We can say, oh, there's no problem with that. The people who get the benefit are the people who pay for the benefit, and so there's no excessive government spending, there's no excessive government growth in that case, just as in the ditch digging case. But when the government can borrow and then push the payments off for decades, we have now, this is my last slide, we have now people today spending other people's money. And here's where the negative consequences of government deficit financing come in. If the government can, or to be precise, if today's citizens, taxpayers, through their representatives in the Knesset or the Congress or the Parliament, can push by borrowing the cost of today's activities onto future taxpayers, then in effect, today's citizens, taxpayers are spending other people's money. They're spending the money of people in the future. They're able to acquire goods and services for their benefit, if they choose, that they don't have to pay for. You have the guy, you have someone else pay for them. Russ Roberts, who was at dinner on Sunday, and who helped Bob plan this event, wrote a wonderful piece in the Wall Street Journal many years ago, even before I knew him. It was titled something like, "If you're paying, I'm having steak." And he says, well, you know, if you're at a dinner party, if you're to go to a restaurant, and you look at the menu, and you know, it's got a number of different menu items on it, and they have the chicken dish, and it's priced lower than the wonderful steak dish. You like them both, and so you can choose to buy the steak rather than the chicken, but the steak costs more money. You will choose to buy the steak only if the steak is worth the extra amount of money to you, as opposed to buying the chicken. Well, let's say, so you've decided it's not worth that to you. It costs an extra, 50%. Then it's 50% more costly, or 100% more costly than the chicken. So you've decided, I like the steak, but it's not worth the extra shekels. So you see the wait staff coming over, you're about ready to order the chicken, but just before you order, someone shows up and says, it's your lucky day. All right, I'm a really rich person and I'm feeling generous. I'm paying for your meal. So now what do? Oh, I'll have the steak. Right? So in this case, and now in this particular case, there's no wrongdoing. You had someone voluntarily agreeing to pay for your meal. But note what you did. The extra, to you, the value of the steak is not worth, or the extra value compared to the chicken of the steak meal is not worth to you the higher price. Which is why if you had to spend your own money on it, you wouldn't buy it. But now that someone else is paying for it, now you buy it. So you actually consume something that's not worth to you the extra amount that it costs.
But the difference between this example and anything else, it's not a rich person that comes in. It's my children.
That's exactly right.
Do I care about the future of my child, or even do I understand the implication of what I do today on my future generation?
This is exactly the question, right? And so when you see the rich person agreeing to pay, it's not a problem. You don't feel guilty about buying this steak. You've agreed to pay, so it's basically I'm being given a gift, right? I don't mind taking the gift because the person's voluntarily offering it. In the case of deficit financing, the people who are paying are not necessarily rich benefactors. They're not agreeing, unlike in the steak example.
It might be they're not even existing yet. In existence. But it's not the case.
I would push back. I would say they are in fact not agreeing. They might, when they are born and then come to assess the situation, they might then agree, oh, I'm glad the past generations did this. But under no circumstances can anyone who's not yet born agree to anything. So they don't agree to it.
But we assume that they will enjoy the airport.
We can assume that, but we don't have to assume that. But if we assume they still pay.
There is an alternative to this dynamic, because I don't see right now in the economic system of these days and the operating system of governments that there is an alternative to this circle of that every generation is spending the money of the next generation, and the previous generation is spending this generation money, and so on.
I think there is. It's clearly an alternative. Now, it may not be politically viable, but there is an alternative that is certainly physically doable, and that is have a government bound by what we call in the U.S. a balanced budget amendment. It's a requirement. It has to balance annually. It has to balance its budget. Now, I think there are good things to say in favor of such a requirement. I think it's got a downside, but it's certainly possible. Whether or not it's worthwhile is a separate question, but it can be done. Yes, sir.
That's a very good point, but the carrying cost of the debt is being paid by the present generation, the carrying cost. So this rich man would say, I lend you the money, but you got to pay me interest on the money that I lend you. So actually, now you shift it back to the present generation.
Say the last thing, I didn't hear it.
You shift it back in cost to the present generation by having them pay interest. The principal gets paid in the next generation, maybe, because there's a rollover, right? There's a rollover. But the carrying charges are paid by this generation.
Well, it's paid by the
generation. Which is a bond for $1 billion. We pay today interest on that bond every year.
So I agree, but let me amend it and see if, and you tell me if I'm wrong. The carrying cost is paid by whatever generation has to pay the servicing cost of the debt. Right. And so some of that might be paid today. But if 10 years from now, more interest payments are due, then that interest, that servicing obligation 10 years from now is paid for by people 10 years from now, even before the principal comes due.
Right, but because of the present value of money, it's probable that most of the cost is borne in this generation. Right?
So
interest payment in 30 years from now is nothing.
So you are bringing into the discussion something called the Ricardo equivalence theorem. I'm actually going to mention David Ricardo tomorrow in my talk on trade. Nothing to do with his analysis of public debt. But the Ricardo equivalence theorem, which I think is what you're referring to, is that, well, if, to put it simply, if it's because current taxpayers today, current citizens know that there's an obligation to repay in the future. The simplest way to think of it is they want to put aside money today in order to create a sinking fund to pay off the debt when it comes due. And so if that were true, so if I'm a citizen taxpayer today and I realize that my children are going to have to pay, you know, I lent $25 today, my children or grandchildren 30 years from now have to pay $108 on that. I don't want to burden them with that debt, and so I put $25 aside today, let it grow at the same rate of interest, and so in a bond for my grandchildren to redeem. And so when my grandchildren's tax debt comes due, they take that bond, they redeem the bond, they take the $108 they got from, or 108 shekels they got from the bond, they pay off their tax bill. Ricardo, it's called the Ricardo equivalence theorem, because if that were true, then taxation and debt financing would indeed be equivalent to each other. They'd be the same. Not that the following point has much significance, but if you read Ricardo carefully, Ricardo said, yes, if this were to happen, I'm paraphrasing, this is not his exact words, if this were to happen, then taxation to pay for today's project and debt financing to pay for today's project would be equivalent to each other. But, says Ricardo, that doesn't happen. Ricardo was, like all the classical economists, very skeptical of deficit financing. He said it does not happen precisely because the deficit financing allows today's citizens to impose much, if not all, but much of the cost of today's programs onto taxpayers not yet born. And so you get no Ricardo equivalence in the real world. There's a fairly large literature on, an empirical literature on studying whether or not, how citizens today respond to deficit financing of their governments. It differs from country to country because it depends upon the fiscal stability of each government. For stable governments, such as, and governments, which are most of them, that have the power of printing money, Ricardo equivalence does not seem to be much of a factor, which gets to the problem that I mentioned a moment ago, the big problem of deficit financing. The costs get pushed forward to people not yet born. It's doubtful, in my view, whether or not citizens today, when the government says, oh, look, we're going to build the airport and you don't have to pay for it. We're not going to raise taxes. Don't worry. We're not going to pay for it. We're going to borrow money. And look, the Keynesians here say it's not going to cost us. It's not going to cost your children or grandchildren anything. So don't feel guilty about voting for the airport project to go forward. And so you say, great, I can get a new airport. My taxes are not going to rise. You're spending other people's money, which means, like in the steak situation, the temptation is too high for you to have the government undertake projects that you do not really value highly enough to pay for. but the projects are undertaken nevertheless because the cost is being paid by someone else. Future citizen taxpayers, they're not even born, they're certainly not voting. And when you add to that fact that the vast majority of voters don't sit through a dull lecture like this, or pick up Jim Buchanan's 1958 book and read about the burden of public debt, and come to oh my gosh, I really realize that the burden of, that this deficit financing is going to lead to increased taxes on my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They don't do that. The government promises to provide this project. I don't have to have my taxes raised today. That's all I need to know. Go ahead with it. And so the problem with deficit financing, as I see it, is that it in fact does impose a burden on today's citizens, taxpayers. The burden is not in the form of having to pay off the debt. They don't pay the debt. That's borne by people in the future. The burden is in the form of excessive government growth today. The government, through deficit financing, is able to undertake projects that even its own citizens do not believe are worthwhile. If they had to pay for them, they wouldn't pay for them. But because they don't have to pay for them, the government undertakes them. So even today's own citizens don't believe that they are worthwhile. There was some tingling in the room. Yeah. Let me just finish this thought. So, and so today's government grows excessively as a result of its ability to resort to deficit financing. That creates all sorts of inefficiencies and drains on economic growth. Yes, we can imagine that the debt incurred, that the projects today paid for with the debt are in fact productive. No doubt some of those do happen. In which case, then in that case, the deficit financing is worthwhile. And if it were the case that God were running the country, but not providing the resources, God's running the country, and God says, this project X is going to promote economic growth, and the vast majority of the fruits of that growth will be borne by future generations. It's going to be enjoyed by future generations. Then, and Ricardo said this, Adam Smith said this, Jim Buchanan said this, then, in that case, well, it would be appropriate to engage in deficit financing. Why should people today pay all the costs for a project, the fruits of which are mostly going to be enjoyed by future generations? Let's have future generations pay those costs. And they won't mind paying those costs because God told us that the benefits to those future generations are going to be worth more than they have to pay. But God's not running the country. God doesn't tell us this. In fact, what happens is that, or a danger, it's too high of a danger, that when government can resort to government financing, not only does it use government financing to build infrastructure projects, such as the airport that I had here, which again may well be worthwhile to future generations, in which case in principle they should pay for it, and they do. But people today are able to consume more resources at the expense of future generations. They're able to use resources today in a way that benefit them, in ways that are not truly worthwhile to them because they're not willing to pay for it. And by having all those resources consumed today, excessive amounts of resources today consumed through deficit financing, that is a drain on the economy over time. The economy doesn't grow as fast as it would, and that is the real cost. And that imposes a cost both on people today who are not the immediate beneficiaries of the spending, and on future generations who not only have to pay the bonds when they come due, but who also are living in an economy that hasn't grown as much as it otherwise would have because the government in the past was able to resort to deficit financing. You had a question over here? Yeah.
Yeah, but if the government justifies every bond raising by future prosperity and growth, why is it a problem? Why it's a problem if they justify every bond raising by prosperity and growth, like the airport? So if you take all the money only for investments, so why raising bonds is a problem?
Well, we need to know if the project is worthwhile to the people who are paying for it. And I don't see any obvious way to know that. Look, in the case of government spending on infrastructure projects or national defense, to keep the country safe today, so that, not overrun by barbarians today, it's just an unavoidable problem. We need a new airport. I would say, and we know that that airport's going to last for 30 years or 50 years. So we make this estimate, okay, it's worthwhile to have future taxpayers pay the bulk of those costs. And it might be an educated guess, it might be true, but we still don't know because those people are not consulted. It is possible that 30 years from now, the citizens' taxpayers will say, oh, I got to pay off these bonds or have to service the debt on these bonds. And what were these bonds issued for? Pay for that airport. I don't like that airport. I get no benefit from that airport. We can't know that today. Now, again, it's an unavoidable problem. The airports have to be built, so we have to make some educated guess. But the problem is precisely because the government today, through deficit financing, can spend the money of other people, then it is too likely, it's not guaranteed, of course, but it's too likely, given human nature, that much of what government does today, that it funds with borrowed funds, will in fact not be worthwhile to the future generations who have to pay for it. Certainly, if I'm consuming today, if my benefits go up today, my government benefits go up today, and those benefits are being paid for with debt, it's highly unlikely that my grandchildren are going to think, oh, I'm so glad that Grandpa got that increase in government projects so he could take a vacation to Tahiti, and now I'm paying for it. And so you just have, it's the nature of government. You can't avoid when you have government, some people spending other people's money.
But you can bound it by law that you can match the growth rate with the rate of the bond, the rate of the interest.
What, you mean the growth rate of the economy?
Yeah, what you expect for me to do.
Yeah, but that's well, I'm not sure you can do that. You can say you're doing that.
Yeah.
You can say you're doing that, but the political impulse is to say, oh, look, we've been growing at 2.5% or 3% annually, and so we can issue credit, we can borrow money at 3% because the economy's growing. Oh, no problem. But then you're spending other people's money, you're using resources wastefully. That very act may actually slow the growth of the economy over time.
So what you're saying is like the government should think like a rational customer that borrows money for investing and not for spending.
That's what the government should do. And my claim is that while in some cases the government does that almost of necessity, in too many cases, when resort to deficit financing is easy, the temptation to overspend today is too great. And that overspending today actually reduces the rate of economic growth over time because resources today are being wasted.
Especially if you cannot measure what will be you cannot hope even to imagine who the people that will run the company in 50 years from now, and if they'll move to a welfare state kind of mindset, then all the mechanisms you built today to offer prosperity will be used to welfare today that is unprosperous by definition.
Yes. Yeah. So let me say.
Once you build a mechanism, there's hardly a way to go back. So you have to really think about the mechanism because it's a hammer. You can use the hammer to break someone's head, and you can nail a nail.
That's right. That's exactly right. And you want the hammer to be used only to drive nails, but unfortunately, if the person holding the hammer can gain by knocking someone in the head, the temptation is too great for a few people to get knocked in the head. And that's the problem with deficit financing. Jim Buchanan who I mentioned, who was the inspiration for this talk, he was pretty much just an academic scholar. He did very little writing for the general public. Most of his speeches and most of his papers and books were written for academic audience, fellow economists and political scientists. He almost never got involved himself in political issues. He never testified before Congress, although he was asked to many times. There's one huge exception. Well, two exceptions. One was irrelevant here. Back in the 50s, he was involved in a school choice issue. But later in his career, after he won the Nobel Prize, or rather at the time he won the Nobel Prize, and really until he died 10 years ago, he was intimately involved in one political movement, not as a formal lobbyist, but it's one that he devoted his time and energy to, and that is to a balanced budget amendment. He supported a balanced budget amendment in the United States. He wanted the U.S. government, to be bound annually to balance its budget with some exceptions. Now, I think there's some merit to that. I think there's some downsides, some dangers in a balanced budget amendment too. It doesn't work as smoothly as it does in reality, I think, as it would on paper. But this was the constraint. Buchanan basically argued the danger of people today overspending, wasting resources today because they can push the bill for those wastes onto future generations is so high. Let's constrain the government. I understand, says Buchanan, there are costs to that, but the benefits, I believe, say Buchanan, of constraining the government to keep its annual budget balance are worth incurring those costs. Just real quickly, there is one way for future generations to escape paying the cost, and that's default. So if the government were to default on the debt, well, then the future citizens, taxpayers don't have to have their taxes raised. But it's still the case that the projects funded with that debt are paid for by someone else. They're paid for, in the case of default, by the poor creditors who are left holding the bill. They have these bonds that they were going to cash in, and the government says, sorry, I'm not paying for them. And then it winds up being that the creditors alone wound up paying for those projects. No matter how you slice it, deficit financing allows people today to impose costs on people on other people, and that encourages people today to spend wastefully, to waste resources, which is harmful to economic growth.
Yep. Do you think in this argument there is anything special about governments issuing bonds, or is it just an inherent attribute of deficit funding? For example, a private company can also issue bonds, and you can say that the future stakeholders or shareholders would pay for the money spent now, and the managers of the company, even though they're supposed to look long-term, might be more focused on short-term growth.
There are two distinctions between government and private companies. One is, unlike any private company, national governments have most national governments have the power to issue currency and the power to print money. That, unfortunately, reduces the risk to creditors of lending to the government. So that the ability to basically inflate the money supply, to inflate the money supply, reduces the risk to creditors of lending money, because, well, again, the government can't raise taxes, we can print money. Now, I'll get paid. So by having resort to the printing press, that's one distinction that no private company has. A second distinction is that there are no shares of government trading on private equity markets. So there's no net present value of government that we can point to. If a private company borrows irresponsibly, there are perfectly good reasons for borrowing in the case of government and also in the case of private companies. If a private company borrows excessively, then its share values will fall. Investors will say, this company is taking on too much debt, or this company is taking on debt and using the funds irresponsibly, not in a way that's going to increase its profitability over time. And therefore, the share value of that company is going to fall. So there's a natural market constraint. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect in the real world. Nothing works ideally. But the decline in the share value of the firms on the market, which will likely occur if the government overborrows, puts a natural constraint on the ability of private companies to overborrow. If private companies overborrow, they then can go bankrupt. It's very difficult for sovereign governments to go bankrupt, particularly ones that can issue new money. So there are those two distinctions. But you're right. Private companies can overissue, but there's a natural constraint there that doesn't exist with the government. Yeah, and then here. Yeah.
The debt bar at the U.S. does not limit the budget of the government and the spending of the government. There is a difference between the debt bar and the limitation of the budget that the government can spend. Yeah, there is.
You're talking about the debt ceiling, the so-called debt ceiling in the U.S.? Yeah. This is an issue of much contention. I think the whole debt ceiling thing is kind of a farce, although it may be a farce worth undertaking. So the debt ceiling in the U.S., I'm not sure I'm answering your question here, but real quickly, the debt ceiling is Congress alone, at least this is how it's constitutionally supposed to be, alone has the power to spend money. Right? The president just disperses the money that Congress tells the president to spend. And so the Congress says, well, we want to appear responsible. So, you know, we will set a debt ceiling. We promise that the size of our national debt will not go higher than X. I'm not sure what it is now. It will not go higher than X. And this constrains us, American people, from spending too much money. So we're being fiscally responsible. We have a debt ceiling. Well, the government keeps spending, not mostly, but increasingly large sums of which are borrowed from creditors. So the national debt in the U.S. rises and it approaches the debt ceiling. And so what happens? In theory, what Congress should do is, oh my, we're approaching the debt ceiling. That means we have to limit our spending. Or we have to limit our debt. If we want to spend more, we have to raise taxes. Or we shouldn't spend more because we have this debt ceiling that we are morally and legally obliged to live by. But what happens instead? We're approaching the debt ceiling. Current citizens, taxpayers, they don't want to give up their benefits. They don't want to have their taxes raised. And so they say, and their representatives in Congress know this, so the representatives in Congress say, well, let's raise the debt ceiling. So they raise the debt ceiling. They go to the floor of Congress and say, let's raise the debt ceiling by X number of dollars. Yes, and they all vote. It's very democratic. Debt ceiling gets raised, and suddenly the United States government is fiscally responsible again. Not because they constrain themselves on the spending front, not because they constrain themselves, not because they raise taxes today to pay for that spending, but simply because they went through this legislative maneuver of raising the debt ceiling. This debt ceiling, every time it's been approached, has been raised. No one now believes that the debt ceiling serves its original purpose of actually constraining the government, the U.S. government, to keep its national debt under some limit. The government is, and the government, knowing this, knows, oh, we can spend whatever we want. We don't have to raise your taxes to fund this spending. And when we approach the debt ceiling, there'll be a lot of political sound and fury. Republicans for a few days will say, oh, it's horribly irresponsible to raise the debt ceiling. And Democrats will say, well, which spending programs would you like to cut? Republicans. And Republicans say, we want to cut your favorite spending programs. And Democrats say, we're not going to cut our favorite spending programs. We want you to cut your spending programs. Oh, no, our spending is all fiscally responsible. We can't cut one penny of that. So no one wants to cut the spending. And so at the end of the day, they always agree to raise the debt ceiling. And so there is, in fact, no limit on what the government, no legally imposed limit on what the government can do. The way these things work in practice is that fiscal calamities, government fiscal calamities, often occur by surprise. Things appear to be going along very smoothly. Oh, nope, no problems here. And all of a sudden, creditors get really, really worried, and they start cashing in their debt. Interest rates rise really high. Interest payments on the U.S. government debt are now at an all-time high as a portion of GDP. The fiscal, I call it fiscal incontinence of the federal government is as never before, even compared to spending in wartime, which is the one time when most people think, okay, well, you know, deficit spending is perfectly fine here because we have to defend ourselves against the barbarians who want to kill us. But there are no barbarians. We're not really at war in the U.S. This spending is being done for to relieve college graduates of their need to repay their student loans, for example. This is not an existential threat. Student debt's not an existential threat to the American economy. And so the ability to borrow unrestrained, I think, poses grave danger when it will result in any particular country, my own, the U.S., in a fiscal crisis. No one can say. I hope I'm dead when that happens, so I don't have to bear it. But if I have no doubt that if things keep going along the way they're going now, with absolutely no fiscal constraint on the way the government is spending, that at some point U.S. government credit all of a sudden is going to dry up, and there will be hell to pay for whoever is alive then. Another great economist who I'm past my time. I'm sorry. Reality is not optional, and that's true even if you're a government. Thank you all.